Hi, this is Chuck Stull, continuing our look into the beer industry and looking at intellectual property. And I really want to focus on trademarks. Patents and copyrights are not particularly important in beer, but trademarks are very important. Now, trademarks are words, names, symbols, or devices that identify a particular product. Trademarks in the United States are registered with the Patent and Trademark Office. And for example, Anheuser-Busch owns the name Michelob. They have the logo, the ribbon device. The bottle shape would also be trademarked. This is an older bottle. And the slogan, "Weekends were made for Michelob," would be another trademark of Anheuser-Busch. Now, trademarks, unlike patents, don't expire. They can need registration, as I mentioned, with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, although you can also establish a name through use. The owner has exclusive use of the trademark. They can prevent others from using it. The protection is the responsibility of the owner. The trademarks can be bought, they can be sold, and they can be licensed. Now, before we go on, not everything can be trademarked. You can't trademark a generic name like beer. You couldn't claim that as a trademark and prevent anyone else from using it. And the protection is fairly narrow. So Monster Energy Drink and Monster Cables for audio systems are two separate companies, each using the trademark Monster. Now, one of the famous trademark purchases was when Miller purchased the Light brand from Meisterbrau in 1972, a small Chicago brewer who, I'm not even sure they were operating at that point, but Miller developed, repositioned, and advertised Light as Miller Light very heavily, and it became a huge seller and continues to be one of the best-selling beers today. Similarly, at around the same time, Miller licensed Lowenbrau from a German brewery, and they used that from the 1970s to the early 2000s. So this was just a license agreement, and the Miller Lowenbrau was only produced in the United States. The German brewery continued to produce its own beer according to its own recipe, but using the same name. Now, if you look at these bottles, the label will probably be familiar to some of those, but the name of the beer, if you look closely, may be a little bit different than what you're expecting. So this is Solson beer, trademarked by Larry Bell, someone who started his home brewing in the K College dorms, at least that's what they say. And in 1992, Solson was released and became a very popular summer beer. Now, this trademark was challenged by Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch was importing another beer called Sol from Mexico, and Sol in Spanish means sun, and Anheuser-Busch argued that Solson was a violation of the trademark on the Sol beer. And so in 1997, Bell's changed its name from Solson, kept the same recipe, but renamed the beer Oberon, which is probably the name that you may be familiar with. Now, these trademark disputes are not that uncommon in the beer industry. So the world's best-selling beer is Budweiser, but I had an opportunity to visit the Czech Republic several years ago, and I ordered a Budweiser, and I got a very different beer. And of course, I knew it was going to be a very different beer. So there has been, for nearly a century, an ongoing dispute between two breweries over who owns the name Budweiser. So Anheuser-Busch, now InBev, AB InBev, owns Budweiser and has sold Budweiser in the United States for over a century. But there's a Czech brewery which has used the same name for longer. Now, for many, many years, this didn't matter because beer was not shipped internationally and we didn't have multinational brewers. But that did come into dispute once we were able to ship beer. So Anheuser-Busch located in St. Louis at the time, headquartered in St. Louis, started producing Budweiser in 1876 and had well-established U.S. rights. The Czech brewery, whose name I'm not even going to try, was founded in 1895, but the name had been in use since the 1200s. And the Czech brewery had well-established European rights. And essentially, they came to a deal in 1911 to divide the world, that Anheuser-Busch would own the Budweiser brand in North America, and that Budvar would have the Budweiser brand in Europe. Now, this became more complicated with the expansion of global breweries and the rise of imported beer, which we'll look at in a later video. But if you look closely at this slide, you will see that Anheuser-Busch sells Budweiser in some countries not as Budweiser, but as either Bud or just as B. And the Czech Budvar, the Czech Budweiser, is available in the US, but not sold as Budweiser, but the same beer is labeled under the Czechvar label and is available here in the United States. Now, one of the expansions of trademark law is known as trade dress. And so there are certain products that have such a strong overall appearance that they are readily recognizable and identifiable with a brand. So here we have Budweiser, after it was bought by a multinational company, right, selling itself labeled just as America, right? So trying to tie back to its roots as opposed to its current ownership. But this confused no one who was looking to buy a Bud. But trade dress does give some additional protection to well-known products. Now, trade dress is looking at the overall appearance and total image, and this may be protected if the design is distinctive and non-functional, and if consumers could be confused by others' use of a similar look. So this is less clear than a name or a symbol, but it's that combination of the color, the shape, typeface, the overall look and feel. So these bottles shown in this illustration are actually dog toys, so they're not in the beer market at all. But Anheuser-Busch didn't like the butt wiper dog toy and took them to court. And in 2008, the court found that the butt wiper use of the overall look of the Budweiser bottle was a violation of Anheuser-Busch's trade dress, and the dog toy company needed to cease production and sales of that product. This has been Chuck Stull looking at trademarks in the beer industry. Thank you for listening.